A Navy SEAL and his little daughter were living a quiet life in the Montana wilderness when a sudden, lethal fog rolled in, swallowing the world in white and separating the girl from her home. As the father's heart raced with the paralyzing fear of losing her to the freezing woods, a low, disciplined growl vibrated through the mist. And as he turned his head, he saw the engine of the old Ford F-150 rumbled on the gravel-covered trail, leaving behind trails of pale gray smoke that dissipated into the thin Montana air. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with hands covered in calluses, his eyes narrowing against the sunlight reflecting off the distant snow-capped peaks. It had been 6 months since he hung up his Navy SEAL uniform, but it seemed his body had yet to truly adapt to the stillness of home. He often woke at 4 in the morning, ears straining for the harmless sounds of a log cabin, his hand instinctively reaching for a rifle that was no longer there. Sarah, his wife, said he needed a friend to share those silences with, and that was why he was here, standing before the gates of the county animal shelter. Inside, the shelter smelled of disinfectant mixed with damp fur, creating a chaotic and noisy atmosphere. Dozens of dogs of all breeds barked thunderously the moment they saw a person, lunging at the wire mesh and wagging their tails frantically, begging for attention. Ethan walked past the rows of kennels slowly. He wasn't looking for exuberance or playful yapping. He was searching for something else, an understanding that only those who have stood on the line between life and death can recognize. He stopped at the end of the hallway, where there was a kennel so quiet it felt strange. There, a powerful German shepherd sat motionless on the cold cement floor. He didn't bark, nor did he lunge like the others. Instead, he sat perfectly upright, front paws parallel, ears pricked keenly forward. His coat was primarily black with ginger gold markings on his legs, but what left Ethan stunned were his eyes. The enemies. You've got a good eye. The shelter manager's voice rose behind him, cutting through Ethan's thoughts. His name is Major. He was a K-9 officer in Chicago, but an explosion during a drug raid took some of the strength from his back leg. The unit had to retire him. Many people come to see him, but they always pass him over because Major is too cold. He never does tricks or wags his tail to please anyone. Ethan didn't answer immediately, busy staring at the long, faint scar running down Major's hind leg. He knew that feeling, the feeling of being considered surplus after giving everything to the mission. He stepped closer, not rushing to reach through the bars to pet him, for he knew a soldier does not care for sudden pity. He stood at attention, arms hanging, naturally at his sides, maintaining a respectful distance before speaking in a low, deep voice. "Hello, partner. I heard you just finished your service too." As if by some miracle, Major didn't back away. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes boring into Ethan's as if scanning a manifest of comrades. He noticed the scar on Ethan's neck and the way he stood firm despite his left shoulder being slightly canted from an old injury. Major stood up, his movements slow but authoritative, though his back leg trembled slightly under his weight. He stepped right up to the iron fence and gave a sharp snort, his hot breath huffing against Ethan's hand. Ethan smiled, a rare smile that smoothed the tired wrinkles on his forehead. He felt a jolt go through his heart, for this was the connection he had been searching for. Major didn't need an owner to raise him. He needed a commander to protect, and Ethan needed a teammate to watch over his sleep. He turned to the manager and spoke with the decisive tone of an officer giving an order. "I'm taking him. Right now." The paperwork went quickly because no one wanted to keep a difficult dog like Major. When Ethan opened the tailgate of the pickup, Major didn't wait for a command. He took a leap and hopped into the truck bed, though his injured leg made him stumble slightly. He immediately chose a spot right behind the cabin, where he could best observe both the front and rear of the vehicle. Ethan started the engine, its roar echoing in the quiet parking lot. He looked through the rearview mirror and saw Major, sitting proudly, his fur blowing in the wind, his gaze fixed steadfastly ahead. "Let's go home, Major. Your new mission is to protect Maya and Sarah. And maybe me too, Ethan muttered to himself as he hit the gas. The pickup began to roll out of town, heading toward the vast meadows of Montana. Throughout the drive, Ethan didn't turn on the radio as he usually did, occupied by the sound of Major's steady breathing behind him. The dog's presence made the cabin feel suddenly warmer and safer. He knew that daily life ahead would still have many difficulties as they both integrated. But at that moment, he felt an unusual lightness in his heart. He was no longer a lonely soldier running from the past, and Major was no longer a surplus item locked in a cage. They were two broken pieces of war, now found by each other to begin a new chapter under the deep blue American sky. As the truck turned onto the road leading to the timber ranch, Ethan saw Sarah and little Maya waiting. On the porch, he took a deep breath, shifted the gear to park, and whispered to his new friend, "Get ready, Major. Our squad is almost complete." Major gave a low rumble in his throat as if in response, and for the first time, his tail thumped lightly against the side of the truck, creating a dry but hopeful sound. Part one of the journey ended here, at the threshold of a home where scars would begin to heal through love and absolute loyalty. Major's first days at the ranch were not noisy in the way people usually expect when a family welcomes a new pet. There was no boisterous barking, no frantic running through the living room, and no lunging for food. Instead, Major established his presence quietly and with great discipline, as if he were taking over a new guard post, rather than a home. Immediately after stepping off the pickup, Major spent the entire afternoon walking around Ethan's vast property. He sniffed every old oak tree, checked the rotting wooden fence behind the horse barn, and stopped for a long time at the main gate leading to the highway. Ethan stood on the porch, a cup of hot coffee in hand, silently observing his new friend. He understood these actions because he had done the same hundreds of times whenever his unit moved to a new deployment site. This wasn't a walk. It was a reconnaissance of the terrain. Once he had grasped every nook and cranny, Major chose a fixed spot for himself. He didn't care for the soft rug Sarah had prepared in the warm living room. Instead, he chose the left corner of the wooden porch, where there was just enough cover from rain and sun, but a panoramic view of the surroundings. From that position, Major could watch the dirt road leading to the house, the garden where Maya played, and the front door. He lay there, front legs stretched straight, head held high, ears always swiveling with the wind to catch any strange sound. To Major, rest was also a state of combat readiness. The appearance of a large, imposing dog with a jet-black coat, burnt gold accents, and a long scar on his leg initially made little Maya apprehensive. The 4-year-old girl, used to soft stuffed animals, often hid behind her mother's legs whenever Major walked by. Sarah was also a bit worried, frequently reminding Ethan to keep an eye on Major, fearing that the instincts of a working dog might pose a danger to a child. However, children have a very keen intuition regarding safety. Maya began to curiously observe the gentle giant from the kitchen window. She saw that Major never growled or showed aggression. Whenever Maya gathered enough courage to step onto the porch, Major would automatically shrink back. He didn't lunge to lick her face like the neighbor's golden retrievers. Instead, he simply lowered his head, avoiding direct eye contact so as not to seem threatening. His tail would thump the wooden floor in slow, steady beats. Thump sound like a friendly but restrained greeting. The turning point happened one beautiful sunny afternoon when Maya decided to bring her toy tea set out to the lawn. She arranged the tiny plastic cups on a tablecloth and then timidly looked toward Major, who was lying at his usual guard post. "Come here, big dog," Maya called softly, her voice trembling slightly. Major opened his eyes, ears pricked. He didn't rush over immediately, but rose steadily, adjusted his posture, and walked step by step toward the girl. When he arrived, he lay down exactly 2 meters away from Maya, a perfect distance, close enough to protect, but far enough not to knock over the fragile plastic cups. Throughout that afternoon, while Maya chatted away to her dolls, Major just lay there, chin resting on his front paws, eyes half closed as if sleeping, but actually observing every movement around. The garden. From that day on, Maya called Major her gentle giant. The relationship between Ethan and Major took on a different tone, deeper and more masculine. They didn't need affectionate gestures or gushing praise. Their bond was built on mutual understanding and shared living space. Ethan's mornings usually began at 5 a.m., when the mist had yet to clear from the Rocky Mountain peaks. He would brew coffee and sit on the wooden steps to enjoy the biting Montana cold. Major would wake at the same time, silently walking out to sit beside him, his shoulder brushing Ethan's thigh. Together they watched the horizon, listening to the hawks calling, sharing a stillness that only those who have lived through fire can truly appreciate. Major seemed to understand the dull aches in Ethan's body whenever the weather changed. At times when Ethan massaged his left shoulder, where he'd taken a bullet, Major would nudge his cold, wet nose into Ethan's hand, a clumsy but sincere gesture of comfort. He didn't demand attention. He just wanted Ethan to know, "I am here, you are not alone." One afternoon, Ethan decided to repair the wooden fence surrounding the backyard. The harsh Montana afternoon sun beat down on his sweat-soaked back. Manual labor helped Ethan release stress, but the heat and the meticulousness of hammering nails sometimes made him irritable. He was securing a horizontal plank when he accidentally dropped his wire cutters into the knee-high weeds. "Damn it," Ethan muttered, wiping sweat from his brow and kneeling to rummage through the dense grass. Frustration began to creep in as he couldn't find the tool. Just as he was about to get up to fetch another, Major appeared. He wasn't napping as usual. Seeing Ethan struggling, he walked over without being told. Major lowered his head, sniffing the tangled grass, his ears twitching as he analyzed the scent of metal mixed with damp earth. Seconds later, he used his long snout to nudge a thick clump of weeds, revealing the red handle of the pliers hidden beneath. Major picked up the pliers, not biting hard but holding them gently, then stepped forward and placed them right next to Ethan's boot. He looked up at him, a calm, expectant gaze, not wagging his tail for a reward as if this were his obvious responsibility. Ethan froze for a moment, looking at the pliers, and then at Major. He remembered his days in the service, when a teammate covered his every round, his every sip of water. That feeling flooded back, familiar and warm. He didn't just give Major a casual pat. He slapped the dog's sturdy shoulder twice, the kind of pat a man gives a man. "Good work, partner," Ethan said, his voice deep and steady. Major gave a soft snort, seemingly satisfied with the recognition, then turned back toward the shade of the old oak tree to resume his guard duty. To most Americans, a dog is a family member to be pampered, allowed to sleep on the bed and wear colorful outfits. But to Ethan, Major was an exception. He wasn't a pet for entertainment. He was the missing piece to complete Ethan's new normal life. Major was the sentry for Sarah's sleep, the bodyguard for Maya's innocent games, and the anchor that kept Ethan's calm whenever warm memories threatened to return. The afternoons passed peacefully on the porch, the wind blowing through the dry grass, creating rustling melodies. Ethan sat there. Maya ran in the distance, and Major lay between them, a solid and silent rampart. No one spoke a word about the bond, but in the eyes of all three, an absolute trust had been formed. They were a small squad, and Major was the bravest heart of that squad. Autumn in Montana always arrives with hurried footsteps. The morning might still hold a trace of warm golden sun, but by afternoon, the cold from the north has surged in, carrying the icy breath of a waiting winter. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day that passes so quietly that one easily forgets to be vigilant. Ethan was in the basement, surrounded by old pipes wrapped in black tape. The sound of a wrench hitting metal echoed sharply in the cramped space. He was trying to plug a stubborn leak that had disturbed the family's sleep all week with its steady drip, drip. The smell of damp earth and rust clung to his hands, but Ethan didn't mind. To a soldier used to mud, this was just a trivial chore to keep the home running smoothly. Upstairs, Sarah was busy in the kitchen. The aroma of beef stew and potatoes began to spread, snaking through the door slats down to the basement, signaling that dinner was almost ready. The clinking of knives and boards created a peaceful rhythm of daily life. Everything was fine, or at least it seemed to be. Meanwhile, in the backyard, little Maya was enjoying her own world. She wore a red woolen coat, standing out against the grass that had begun to turn a withered yellow. Maya was playing hide-and-seek with invisible friends, her giggles blending with the rustling wind. Major still lay there, in his familiar spot on the porch, eyes half closed but ears swiveling toward his little mistress's movements. The change began with an uninvited guest. A cottontail rabbit, bold and nimble, suddenly hopped out from the raspberry bushes near the fence. Its long ears twitched, and its pink nose sniffed the air. To a 4-year-old like Maya, it wasn't a wild animal, but a character from a fairy tale. "Wait for me, Bunny," she cheered, her little legs beginning to chase after that fluffy white tail. The rabbit, startled, bolted toward the edge of the woods. Maya didn't think twice. She squeezed through a gap in the rotting wooden fence that Ethan hadn't had time to fix, continuing the chase. Major stood up abruptly. He didn't bark, but his body went tense, his gaze fixed on the red dot moving further away toward the dark pine forest. He stepped down the stairs, but then hesitated, looking back at the closed kitchen door as if waiting for a command or permission. At that moment, Montana's weather turned. A freezing wind whipped through the valley, dragging a thick shroud of fog down from the mountain peaks like a white waterfall. Within 10 minutes, the visibility went from clear to hazy, then was quickly swallowed by a lethal milky white. In the basement, Ethan tightened the final bolt, sighing in relief as the dripping finally stopped. He wiped his hands on an old rag, turned off his flashlight, and climbed the creaky wooden stairs. "Is the stew done, honey? I'm starving," Ethan called out as he entered the kitchen, his voice cheerful. Sarah was tasting the soup. She looked up and smiled. 5 more minutes. Go call Maya in to wash her hands. She's been outside a while. She must be cold." Ethan nodded and headed for the back door. He turned the knob, stepped outside, and was immediately stunned. The cold hitting his face wasn't as terrifying as the absolute silence enveloping the space. No birds, no whistling wind, and most importantly, no sound of Maya's laughter. The fog was so thick he couldn't see the old oak tree 10 meters from a porch. "Maya," Ethan called, his voice calm. There was no answer. "Maya, dinner time." He raised his voice a bit, stepping onto the dew-soaked grass. Still, there was only the silence pressing against his chest. Ethan began to feel a cold jolt run down his spine, that hauntingly familiar feeling he'd experienced during ambushes. His heart hammered, not from exertion but from fear. Fog in this region wasn't just water vapor. It disoriented you, distorted sound, and the temperature could drop to freezing once. The sun fully set. "Sarah," Ethan shouted, turning back toward the house. "Get the flashlight out here. Now." Sarah ran out, her face turning pale when she saw the wall of white mist. "Where is she? Where's Maya?" "Stay here, in case she circles back to the front door. I'm going to find her," Ethan ordered sharply, trying to keep his voice from trembling. He grabbed a high-powered military flashlight and clicked it on, but the powerful beam only pierced the mist for a few steps before scattering into a useless, hazy glow. Ethan lunged into the fog, constantly calling his daughter's name. A father's fear was overriding a soldier's composure. He imagined all sorts of things: the dry well behind the hill, the coyotes that hunted at twilight, or simply the cold that could induce hypothermia in a child so quickly. In his panic, Ethan felt something brush against his leg. Startled, he shone the light down. It was Major. The dog wasn't running wildly or barking frantically. He stood there, looking up at Ethan, his dark eyes reflecting the flashlight but showing no fear. He was unervingly calm. Looking at Major, Ethan felt like he'd been slapped awake. He took a deep breath, pushing back the chaotic fear to make room for tactical thinking. He couldn't just run around. He needed a tracker. Ethan knelt on one knee, level with Major's eyes. He gripped the dog's collar, his voice low and firm. "Major, find Maya. Find the baby." It wasn't a plea. It was a combat order. Major snorted. He had been waiting for this command. The dog turned, nose glued to the damp earth, and began to move. Major didn't run straight. He moved in a zigzag, left and right, sweeping back and forth like a pendulum. Ethan followed close behind, flashlight at the ready. He knew what Major was doing. He was cutting across the wind to catch the thin scent molecules Maya had left behind. They crossed the garden to the gap in the fence. Major paused for a moment, inhaling deeply on a small piece of red fabric caught on a rusty nail, a scrap of wool from Maya's coat. Major looked back at Ethan, giving a low whine in his throat too. "Confirm. Good boy. Keep going," Ethan said, a spark of hope igniting. They crossed the safety of the ranch and entered the dense pine forest. The terrain began to slope downward and became slippery. Pine roots protruded from the ground like preset traps, completely hidden by the layer of mist and leaf litter. Ethan tripped several times, mud clinging to his clothes, but he stood up immediately. His eyes never left the black shadow of Major ahead. The deeper they went into the woods, the colder it became. Ethan's breath came out in white puffs. He began to worry about the time. 20 minutes had passed. For a child, 20 minutes in the deep, freezing woods was far too long. "Faster, Major, faster," Ethan urged, but Major abruptly stopped. He no longer kept his nose to the ground, but held his head high, ears swiveling forward, his body as stiff as a stone statue. Ethan also stopped, holding his breath to listen. The wind whistled. Through the pine tops, a dry branch snapped somewhere, and then a very small, faint sound drifted back from the dry creek bed to the left, the sound of whimpering. Major let out a thunderous bark. It wasn't an alarm for an enemy, but a locating bark. Woof! Woof! The sound pierced the mist, echoing off the rocks. Immediately after, Major bolted. This time he didn't zigzag. He ran straight as an arrow. Ethan poured all his strength into the chase, his flashlight dancing wildly across the tree trunks. "Maya, it's Daddy," Ethan screamed, when Ethan reached the edge of the dry creek. The sight before him made his heart stop and then explode in his chest. Under the base of a tilted old pine tree that formed a small wind-sheltered hollow was Maya. She was huddling, arms wrapped around her knees, her whole body shivering violently from cold and fear. But Maya wasn't alone. Major was curled around her, forming a sturdy, protective arc. He pressed his thick, warm fur against Maya, his head resting on her shoulder. Major didn't stand up to bark or run to Ethan to claim credit. He stayed in that position, using his body heat to warm the most important target. His eyes remained wide, vigilantly watching the surrounding darkness, ready to bare his teeth at anything that dared approach, even if it was just a swaying tree shadow. Seeing Ethan's flashlight, Major finally stood up slowly. He took a step back, making room for the father, but still stood blocking the direction the wind was blowing from. Ethan tossed his flashlight aside and lunged forward to embrace his daughter. "Daddy," Maya sobbed loudly, her tiny, ice-cold arms clinging tightly to Ethan's neck. "I was scared. I chased the bunny. Then it got dark. It's okay. Daddy's here," Ethan whispered, his tears mixing with the sweat on his face. He quickly stripped off his heavy coat and wrapped it tightly around Maya, lifting her up. Ethan turned to look at Major. The dog stood there, panting, tongue out from the exhaustion of the high-stress tracking, but his tail quivered against the damp pine needles. Ethan didn't say a word. He just gave a deep nod, a nod between men, between teammates who had just completed a life-and-death mission. The way home seemed much shorter, even though the fog had yet to clear. Major walked right beside Ethan's leg, occasionally looking up to lick Maya's dangling foot, as if to reassure her that we're almost home. When the warm yellow light from the porch appeared through the mist, Sarah rushed out, crying and embracing them both. The reunion took place right on the wooden steps where Major always lay guard. After ensuring Maya was safe in her mother's arms. Major quietly detached himself. He went to his familiar corner of the porch, gave his dew-soaked fur a vigorous shake, and flopped down, letting out a long, weary sigh. That night, the small log cabin was filled with warmth and the aroma of food. Maya, after a hot bath and soup, was fast asleep on the sofa, still clutching her stuffed animal. Sarah sat beside her, stroking her daughter's hair, her eyes still red. Ethan stood up and went into the kitchen. He opened a refrigerator and took out a prime American beefsteak, as large as a hand, bright red and succulent. This was the meat he had intended for the weekend barbecue, but plans had changed. He didn't grill it. He placed the raw steak in Major's cleanest aluminum bowl. Ethan opened the door and stepped out. Onto the porch. Night had fully fallen. The fog still drifted lazily, but was no longer frightening. Major was lying with his head on his front paws. Hearing the door open, he looked up. Ethan placed the bowl of meat in front of Major. "This is for you, partner. You deserve it more than anyone," Ethan said, his voice husky with emotion. Major didn't dive into the food immediately. He sniffed the meat, then looked up at Ethan with those dark, steady eyes. In that moment, Ethan saw that the gaze was no longer the distant, guarded look of a broken military dog. It was softer, more trusting. Major stood up, approached Ethan, and nudged his large head into Ethan's thigh. And for the first time since Ethan had brought him home from the shelter, Major wagged his tail. It wasn't a polite, social wag, but a powerful, joyful wag that made his whole hindquarters sway. Ethan laughed, sitting down on the cold wooden floor beside the dog. He wrapped his arm around Major's neck, burying his face in the thick fur that still smelled of pine needles and night dew. He felt the strong heartbeat in Major's chest, a rhythm perfectly in sync with his own. Ethan looked out into the pitch-black night, where the Rocky Mountains stood like sentinels guarding the valley. Tonight, he knew he would sleep well. He would no longer have to startle awake to check the windows, no longer fear the ghosts of the past or the dangers of the future. Because now, he didn't have to stand guard alone. Beside him, Major began to enjoy his steak, the sound of rhythmic chewing echoing crisply in the quiet night. Ethan leaned his back against the house pillar, lighting a cigarette, but not smoking it, just letting the smoke drift up to mingle with the night. Mist. He silently thanked the fateful day that brought him to the shelter, thanked the scar on Major's leg, and thanked his resilient silence. They were two souls discarded by war, but in that abandonment, they had found each other to become the greatest protectors of this little family. Ethan knew that from this moment on, Major wasn't just a dog. He was a part of his soul.